There's a moment in your life, quiet, almost invisible, when you suddenly realize that some people are not looking for solutions, healing, or truth. They are looking for permission to remain wounded. And the strangest part is that you can sense it long before they ever speak it aloud. You see it in the way their shoulders hang a little too comfortably in sorrow, in the way their stories circle back to the same point, where they were hurt, misunderstood, overlooked, betrayed. You notice how their pain becomes their identity, how their suffering becomes a shield, how their helplessness becomes a throne. And then the question slips into your mind, soft but unsettling. What if some people hold on to their wounds, not because they cannot let go, but because they fear who they would be without them? You've met these people, you've listened to their stories, you've offered advice, compassion, solutions, encouragement, only to find that none of it lands. It's as if they are standing behind a glass wall, describing a fire while refusing to walk through the open door that would lead them out of the smoke. You start to wonder, is the pain real, or is the pain repeated? Is the suffering chosen, or merely familiar? And maybe, somewhere within you, you ask a deeper, more uncomfortable question. Why do I feel responsible for saving them? Why do I carry the weight that they refuse to lift? Tonight, I want to take you into a place inside the human psyche that few dare to explore, the tender, tangled world of the victim mindset. Not the genuine victim of real harm, but the psychological posture that turns life into an endless stage for misfortune. And as you listen, I want you to ask yourself one thing. What part of you still feels obligated to rescue those who have no interest in leaving their own suffering? Let's begin. You walk through the world and you see people performing versions of themselves, actors in a quiet, unspoken play. The workplace colleague who sighs loudly before every task, subtly hoping someone will notice how overwhelmed they are. The friend who always seems to be in the middle of a crisis. Yet every crisis looks suspiciously similar to the last one. The family member who tells stories of sacrifice so often that their voice almost trembles with pride when describing how much they endure. These aren't accidents. They're patterns, psychological loops disguised as daily life. The victim mindset does not announce itself with dramatic collapse. It reveals itself through micro-expressions, small rituals, the soft gravity of emotions, repeated until they become a personality. You see it at social gatherings. The person who always needs comforting, but never reciprocates. Their sadness becomes a magnet, drawing attention, sympathy, validation, but never change. When joy enters the room, they retreat. When solutions are offered, they push them aside gently, with practiced excuses. It's complicated. You don't understand. Nothing ever works out for me. And as you listen, you feel something inside you tighten, a quiet recognition that the story they're telling is not meant to end. It is meant to continue. You see it at home. A parent who blames their children for their unfulfilled dreams, yet never once examines their own decisions. You see it in relationships. A partner who turns every disagreement into proof of how unloved or mistreated they are. You see it in society. People who cling to grievances as if letting go would erase their identity. Victimhood, when repeated long enough, becomes a refuge. A safe room where responsibility cannot enter, where accountability cannot breathe, where growth feels like a threat rather than a promise. And here is the everyday illusion. The victim believes they are powerless, but the victim role gives them incredible power. The power to control others through guilt, sympathy, or emotional exhaustion. The power to avoid difficult truths. The power to avoid being seen as anything other than fragile. But deeper still, beneath the surface of every victim player lies an internal script that says, if I am helpless, no one can blame me. If I am wounded, no one can expect more from me. If I am always the one hurting, I never have to face the parts of myself I do not want to meet. And you, observing this world, begin to understand the illusion for what it is, a psychological escape disguised as suffering. And slowly, something inside you starts to shift. You begin noticing how often these patterns repeat, not just in others, but in the entire social fabric around you. At the supermarket, a stranger complains loudly about being mistreated by the world because a line moved slower than expected. On social media, people compete for sympathy like it's a currency, trading misfortune for attention, exaggerating disappointment for validation, wearing helplessness like a badge. You start seeing it everywhere. The subtle performance of suffering, the quiet addiction to being wronged, the unspoken belief that the world owes them softness simply because life feels hard. And perhaps the strangest part is how normal it all looks, how socially accepted it has become to center the self around pain. Society has made victimhood feel like a personality, a brand, a moral high ground. But there's a cost to living inside this illusion, a cost that the person playing the victim never pays alone. Those around them pay it too, in emotional labor, in patience, in the exhaustion of listening to stories that end where they began. And you, with your sensitive awareness, feel this cost deeply, almost instinctively, because you recognize that behind the mask of helplessness lies a deeper fear, the fear of knowing that you could change your story, but choosing not to. There comes a moment, perhaps subtle, perhaps sudden, when you begin to see what others cannot. It happens the way dawn arrives, quietly, gradually, then all at once. You realize that some people do not want solutions. They want witnesses. They want a stage on which their suffering can be acknowledged, replayed, admired. They want to be seen as the one who survives, yet never truly stands. And this insight shakes you, not because it is painful, but because it is true. You start recognizing the emotional patterns with clarity that once felt like intuition. You see how a victim-minded person retells the same story, with the same dramatic pauses, the same tragic emphasis, the same self-justifying conclusion. You notice how they reject accountability with elegant, practiced deflection, how every discomfort becomes an injustice, every challenge becomes an attack, every mistake becomes someone else's fault. And as this clarity deepens, you feel something within you awaken a strange mixture of empathy and distance. You empathize with their wounds, but you no longer feel hypnotized by them. You feel their sadness, but you no longer absorb it. You recognize their helplessness, but you no longer confuse it with innocence. You begin to understand the architecture of self-deception, how a person can build an entire identity around the idea of being wronged. You begin to see that the victim role is not just a story they tell, it is a shield they carry, a shield against responsibility, a shield against growth, a shield against the terrifying possibility that they might be stronger than they pretend to be. And with that awakening comes a shift in perspective. You cannot save someone who is committed to remaining powerless. This realization settles into your bones like a quiet truth, one that both frees you and burdens you. Because once you see the pattern clearly, you cannot unsee it. Once you understand the psychology beneath the behavior, you cannot pretend ignorance again. The awakening is a gift, but like all gifts of awareness, it has a price. Awareness has a strange side effect: isolation. When you begin seeing the patterns others miss, you start feeling like an outsider in your own life. You sit at the same table, hear the same conversations, witness the same emotional theatrics, but now you see the wiring behind them, the scripts, the motivations, the hidden emotional economies people trade within. Take, for example, the story of Elias, a gentle, quiet man who always tried to be the healer in every room he entered. In his family, he was the one everyone called when drama ignited. His sister needed comfort. His mother needed assurance. His cousin needed money. His father needed forgiveness. And Elias gave, and gave, and gave, because he believed that being helpful made him good. But every person in his life had a pattern, a story of being wronged, a cycle of recurring problems, a soft refusal to take responsibility. And whenever Elias offered solutions, they resisted. Whenever he tried to help them grow, they shrank. Whenever he tried to guide them out of suffering, they clung tighter to it. One day, after yet another phone call filled with complaints, accusations, and emotional pleas, Elias felt something unravel. He hung up the phone, sat in silence, and asked himself a question he had spent his whole life avoiding. What if I am enabling their suffering by trying to fix it? What if they don't want healing, they want attention? That moment changed him. He began to step back. He began to say no. He stopped rushing to solve problems that people created for themselves. And slowly, he discovered something painful. When he stopped being useful, they stopped being loving. When he stopped being their emotional caretaker, they accused him of being selfish. When he stopped absorbing their chaos, they called him cold. Elias wasn't cold. He was awakening. But awakening is often misunderstood by those who remain asleep. Isolation isn't just being alone, it's being surrounded by people who cannot understand the version of you that sees clearly. You feel the distance growing, not because you are pulling away, but because clarity separates you from those who rely on confusion. You walk through your relationships differently now. You speak less, listen more carefully. Notice the small manipulations, the subtle guilt, the emotional hooks disguised as vulnerability. And the more you see, the more alone you feel. But this loneliness, though heavy, is not a punishment. It is the quiet echo that follows every great shift in awareness. It is the space where your deeper understanding begins to take root. There is a moment, a quiet crossroads, where your awareness forces you into a dilemma you never asked for. You begin to notice that every interaction with a victim-minded person carries a choice. Do you speak the truth and risk becoming the villain, or do you stay silent and participate in the illusion? This becomes the conflict within you, because part of you still wants to help, still wants to soothe, still wants to be the gentle presence that makes everything better. And yet another part, wiser now, sharper, more honest, knows that helping someone who is committed to being helpless does not heal them, it sustains them. Imagine you're talking to someone who always plays the victim. You gently point out a pattern, a possibility, a way forward. Their eyes narrow, their tone shifts. Suddenly you have become the problem, the one who doesn't understand, the one who is making it about yourself, the one who is being insensitive. You watch as they twist your clarity into cruelty, your intention into aggression, your honesty into betrayal, and you feel the conflict tearing at you. Should you protect your peace or protect their feelings? Should you allow the truth to breathe or smother it beneath diplomacy? Should you maintain connection or maintain integrity? This conflict is not small. It shapes your relationships. It changes the way you talk, the way you listen, the way you show up. In rooms where emotional honesty is rare, you begin tiptoeing around certain topics, censoring yourself to avoid triggering someone's fragile identity. You craft your sentences carefully, soften your tone, dilute your truth, all to avoid the emotional explosion that honesty might ignite. And yet deep inside, something feels wrong. Because you know that silence is a betrayal too, not of them, but of yourself. Eventually, you begin to realize that every time you rescue someone from the consequences of their own patterns, you become a character in their story instead of your own. Your emotional freedom becomes hostage to their emotional narrative. And that realization that your compassion can be weaponized against you becomes the turning point in the conflict. There is only so long a mind can carry the weight of other people's unending tragedies. Eventually, something inside you begins to fracture. Not dramatically, not visibly, but slowly, subtly, like a rope fraying strand by strand. You start feeling tired in ways rest cannot repair. A heaviness settles behind your eyes. Your chest tightens not from fear, but from emotional saturation. You hear someone's familiar complaints, and your soul flinches instinctively, not out of annoyance, but out of exhaustion. This is the collapse, not of your strength, but of your tolerance for emotional imbalance. The collapse comes when you realize that empathy without boundaries becomes self-destruction. It comes when you realize that carrying someone else's wounds while they refuse to heal is like trying to keep a sinking ship afloat using your bare hands. Eventually, the water gets in. Your mind becomes crowded with stories that aren't yours. Your heart becomes heavy with emotions you never created. Your spirit becomes tangled in guilt that was never meant to belong to you. And slowly, you feel yourself slipping not into darkness, but into numbness, the emotional equivalent of turning off the lights in a burning room because you can't stand watching the flames anymore. You begin avoiding messages, delaying calls, hesitating before entering rooms where certain people wait with their familiar narratives. You recoil from the emotional gravity they carry, instinctively knowing it will pull you down again. Metaphors rush into your mind. It feels like drowning in someone else's river. It feels like trying to fix a mirror that shatters every time you touch it. It feels like shouting into a canyon that only echoes back your own exhaustion. And the worst part is the quiet guilt. The guilt of withdrawing, of creating distance, of protecting yourself. Because somewhere along the way, you were taught that being good means being endlessly available, endlessly forgiving, endlessly responsible for other people's pain. But now, as you feel yourself collapsing beneath that burden, a question begins to glow faintly within you. What if my collapse is not a failure, but a message? A message that something must change. A message that survival requires boundaries. A message that clarity is not cruelty, it is self-preservation. And then, quietly, something shifts. Not outside you, but within. A revelation soft yet powerful rises in your mind like the first breath after resurfacing from deep water. You realize that you are not responsible for another person's emotional evolution. You are not obligated to fix what they refuse to face. You are not the bridge they walk across when they need comfort, nor the cushion they fall onto when accountability becomes uncomfortable. You begin to understand that compassion without boundaries is not love, it is self-abandonment. And the moment this truth settles into you, the entire emotional landscape changes. You look at the people who always play the victim, and instead of feeling pity or obligation, you feel clarity. You understand that their suffering is not your assignment, their wounds are not your burden, their patterns are not your destiny. You begin to respond differently, gently, but firmly. You stop cushioning their excuses. You stop rearranging your own life to accommodate their emotional storms. You stop feeding the narrative that keeps them small. And something else happens too. You start reclaiming your energy. Conversations feel lighter. Your mind feels cleaner. Your chest feels open again, no longer tight from emotional compression. You begin to rediscover your own needs, your own priorities, your own emotional rhythm. This is the revelation. Your empathy is a gift, but it was never meant to be your prison. As this insight deepens, you begin to understand the delicate difference between helping and enabling. Helping empowers someone to rise. Enabling allows them to remain where they are. And when a person is committed to the victim identity, enabling becomes the fuel that sustains their story. So you stop offering fuel, not out of cruelty, but out of truth. You start seeing your relationships through a new lens. You realize that boundaries are not walls, they are doors. They let the right people in and keep the wrong energies out. Boundaries are expressions of self-respect, quiet declarations that say, my time, my emotions, and my peace matter too. And through this revelation, something remarkable happens. The weight lifts. Not instantly, not dramatically, but gradually, like fog dissolving in sunlight. You feel yourself coming back into your body, back into your center, back into the life you had placed on pause while carrying the emotional load of others. You begin choosing connection that feels reciprocal, conversations that nourish instead of drain, people who listen as much as they speak. You learn to love without losing yourself, to care without collapsing, to give without erasing your own needs. And the revelation becomes your quiet truth. You were never meant to save people who refuse to save themselves. You were meant to see clearly, love wisely, and choose with intention. That is the beginning of freedom. Integration is where the story settles, not in theory, not in insight, but in the way you live your life from this moment forward. You wake up one day and realize that the world hasn't changed, but your relationship with it has. You walk into the same rooms, with the same people, the same dramas unfolding, but now you carry a different center within you. You no longer rush to soothe every discomfort around you. You no longer abandon your own needs to preserve a fragile peace. You no longer step into the role of healer when you were never asked to be one. Instead, you move with intention, clarity, and quiet strength. And this changes everything. The people who once relied on your endless empathy begin to sense the difference. Some will resist it. They will try to pull you back into the familiar roles you once played. The fixer, the caretaker, the emotional sponge. They will test your boundaries, question your distance, interpret your clarity as coldness. But you remain steady, because you know now that their discomfort is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is a sign that you are doing something new. Others, surprisingly, may rise with you. When you stop enabling their victimhood, some will begin confronting their own patterns. Your boundaries may become an invitation for their growth. Your clarity may inspire their self-reflection. Your transformation may become a mirror that shows them what they, too, are capable of. But the most important change happens inside you. You begin reclaiming your peace, the peace lost in emotional labor, in rescuing, in carrying pain that was never yours. You create space within yourself for joy, curiosity, creativity, stillness. You feel lighter, more present, more sovereign. You return to yourself. And with this return comes a deeper understanding of the paradox introduced in the very beginning. Some people hold on to their wounds because they fear who they would be without them. But you have learned to release what was never yours to carry. You have learned that freedom does not come from saving others. It comes from choosing yourself. And in this choice, you honor the deepest truth of all. Awareness is not a burden. It is a doorway back to your own life, a doorway back to your own peace, a doorway back to the version of you who no longer confuses compassion with self-sacrifice, who no longer confuses love with rescuing, who no longer confuses empathy with erasure. You step through that doorway now, quietly, consciously, fully, and for the first time in a long time, you are free.